past have talked about where we would be in the future in terms of technology, such as flying cars. And while we don't have flying cars just yet, we still have made some pretty neat technological advances which have led to ideas such as 3D multi-sensor transmitters. These transmitters is it's essentially a combination of VR, which will help us see things that aren't there, and the sensors will then let us feel and touch things that aren't necessarily there. So today I will be talking about the past, present, and future developments of the 3D multi-sensor transmitters. With that said, I would like to talk about any kind of technology that has possibly led us up to this idea. First, virtual reality, also known as VR. According to an article published to the Franklin Institute in 2017 by Nancy Gupton, users can be transferred into a number of real world and imagined environments. So, for this, I have a visual to show how VR works in essence. So, we have the two devices up top and the person wearing the goggles, and they also have the remote controls. So essentially, the devices send signals to the remotes and the goggles, and the technology is able to process it and produce the images that we can see, whether they're real or they could honestly be things such as dragons. Next, I'd like to touch on augmented reality, also known as AR. Gupton states that Snapchat lenses and Pokemon Go are also examples of AR. Essentially, augmented reality is the same as VR. It's just a little bit more convenient because you don't have to wear the goggles to see things. You can see these objects through your phone or a tablet. Lastly, extended reality is defined by Gupton, essentially covers all of the various technologies that enhances our senses. So this would be a combination of VR and AR because they will work together to again enhance your senses. With that said, I'd like to move on to the present and how people have been using these types of technology for either educational purposes or even entertainment. Girish R. from the Fingent published an article in 2020 that states XR will allow employees to learn and train in different situations that may be dangerous, but they just won't have to go through the actual process of danger. For example, Girish uses the thought of surgeons practicing their surgery, going through the process and the steps without actually having to use a patient, so they can practice as much as they want and they can use different techniques to ensure that the surgery succeeds. Furthermore, 3D sensors have also become a great use for people. An article that was published in 2020 to Future Bridge explains that direct short light flashes are emitted by a projection module. The data is then processed with coordinates and 3D pictures are generated. So I have another visual aid. So this just shows how these 3D sensors are basically the process. So when an object is in front of the sensor, the laser will scan it and the information will come back to the sensor so that it'll produce the images for us to see. Another thing that people have been using are prosthetics. According to Peter Silva, that published an article to F5 in 2019, he states that the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center has developed a robotic arm that can actually feel things just as a human would. So this robotic arm would, if it were to run its hand over my watch, it would feel the texture and just essentially how humans would feel objects. So obviously people have definitely been using this for health reasons, but it can also be for entertainment purposes because a lot of people have been using these for streaming and games and sorts like that. Now we can move on to the future development of 3D multi-sensor transmitters. Um, M. Mitchell Waldrop from Nature published an article in 2013 that states that a device could accept and process signals that would build up voltage such as a real neuron would. So I have a diagram that shows these neurons. So up top we have a real neuron and below we have the artificial neuron. So the neurons in our bodies already that's processing information and letting us know what's going on around in our environment. It takes the information from the external environment through the dendrites. It travels through the cell body, the axon, and so then it ends up at the axon terminals where the information is processed, and so we can use it to obviously be aware of our surroundings. And the artificial neuron is pretty similar in size and structure, and it also works really similar too. Information from our external environment comes into the neuron, and then it is processed in the bias, and then it comes out as information that is usable for just being aware. Also, according to an article on Science published by Robert F. Service in 2018, he states that future prosthetics may track changes in texture, position, and different types of pressure. So again, this would definitely help the process of 3D multi-sensors because this would let us touch things that aren't necessarily there, as long as we can see them through the VR goggles. And lastly, Rebecca Song from Life Science published an article in 2021 that explains how artificial brain cells may use ions to produce an electrical signal in the same way information gets transferred between neurons in your brain. So again, this goes back to the prosthetics, but developing these neurons would be the biggest part for 3D multi-sensors because again, we are touching things that aren't necessarily there, so it would be a little bit difficult to get information from our external environment and get it processed to our brain. Now that we're nearing the end of my speech, I'd like to go over some of the things I talked about. So in the past, people have developed VR, AR, and essentially it was combined for XR, which just enhances mostly our sight because we're seeing things without them being there. And then I talked about the present and how people have used them. It's mostly been used for health purposes, but again, people can learn and train using these devices without actually having to go through the trouble of being in danger necessarily. And lastly, I talked about the future development of this device. Obviously, it would take a long time because developing these neurons and just imitating the way our bodies work is a lot of work for scientists, but they have made some process in developing some kind of technology that will imitate it. Again, we're not necessarily in flying cars yet, but we have made some pretty good sensory technology advancements.